Welcome back to Sports Class with Dr. K. Hope you're all staying healthy and safe out there. This coronavirus has kind of thrown everybody for a loop, and today's episode we're going to talk a little bit about the effects of the coronavirus on the world of sports. But first I want to let you know of a new development for Sports Class with Dr. K. At the end of every episode we're going to ask a trivia question, so stick around to the end for that. Now, on to the coronavirus. Obviously, one of the big effects of this whole episode is that most sporting events have been canceled or maybe postponed. NCAA March Madness was canceled. The NBA season pulled the plug before they got to the finish line. And all kinds of events have either canceled for the year or they're being pushed back. The Kentucky Derby, the Masters, going to be held at the end of the year. And of course, the Olympics have been postponed until next year. So for this episode, we're going to talk about some other times in history when major sporting events have been canceled for a variety of reasons. Now I'll tell you, I'm not going to focus in this episode about things like strikes and lockouts. We'll have a different episode about that. This is more related to wars or major global events that forced people to cancel sporting events. Okay, let's start with 9/11. Of course, on September 11th, 2001, the terrorists crashed planes into the Twin Towers in New York City, into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and one other one that crashed in Pennsylvania. So first of all, in New York City, much of downtown Manhattan was on fire or in ruins. Infrastructure in the city was thrown for a loop. The subways weren't running, transportation was shut down, emergency personnel was occupied with the disaster itself. And then around the country, flights were grounded for several days and even weeks, so getting around was very difficult. So most sporting events at that time were canceled. The NFL was just starting its season, and MLB, Major League Baseball, was starting to head into the late stages of the season. So those games were canceled for several days, and the NFL canceled the games that were scheduled for that week. So sporting events were largely shut down in the country for a week or more, but they pretty quickly bounced back after that, and many of you might remember when those events started up again, there were some major uplifting sporting events that really helped get the country back on its feet after the 9/11 attacks. The next event I want to talk about is World War I. Obviously, World War I threw global sports into disarray as much of the globe was consumed in war from 1914 to 1919. Most notably, the 1916 Olympics, which were supposed to be hosted by Germany, were canceled altogether in 1916. Now, sports on the home front in the United States were affected less than some of those other sports around the world. World War I really didn't hit the home front as hard as it did certainly those European countries. But it did have an impact. The Major League Baseball season, for instance, was shortened in 1918. Actually, the start of 1919 was delayed. A lot of those players went off to serve in the war. It kind of disrupted the patterns of play. But again, World War I didn't have as much of an impact here in the United States as it did elsewhere around the world. Next, let's talk about World War II. Now, any world war is major, but World War II was much more destructive and damaging than World War I, and obviously most of those European nations weren't going to be able to think about hosting any sporting events during the war. So during World War II, we actually saw 2 Olympics canceled, in 1940 and in 1944. That's how serious the disruption was. And World War II actually hit home in the United States a little bit harder than World War I had. Many players went off to fight in World War II, and a lot of sports teams and even sports leagues in the country were either damaged or shut down while the war was going on. A number of leagues actually combined teams. You saw a lot of minor league teams shutting down. And in the NFL, some teams even played together as one united team during the war. Now, Major League Baseball carried on during the war years largely because President Roosevelt actually contacted the Commissioner of Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and told him baseball was too important to the national spirit, and we shouldn't cancel baseball games. Now, there was one exception to that, and that was D-Day, June 6, 1944. All Major League Baseball games were canceled on that day, but otherwise they carried on during the war. One last World War II thought, that was the only other time the Masters has been canceled. It was canceled from 1943 to 1945, just as it is under the COVID epidemic. Now, the last one I want to mention in this episode is the 1918 influenza pandemic. A lot of people have been asking about that because, of course, it has a lot of similarities to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, one difference is in 1918, we really didn't understand as much about how disease was spread. And so sports on the home front was not as affected as you might think during that 1918 pandemic. People didn't really understand about social distancing and shutting down those kind of major gatherings. And so for the most part, sports carried on unaffected. There were some instances, though, where individual players or teams or parts of teams were affected by the pandemic, which led to some changes. Babe Ruth, for instance, got ill during that time, and that was actually when he made the switch from being both a pitcher and a hitter to just being a position player. He couldn't hold up under the strain of doing both because he was ill. And the Stanley Cup in 1919 actually canceled the sixth and final game because most of the Montreal team playing in that Stanley Cup was ill at the time. So there were a few effects from that 1918 pandemic, but you didn't see the sweeping cancellations that we've seen now under COVID-19. So, there you have it, a number of times in history when sporting events have been canceled. Now, let's get to the trivia question for this episode. I mentioned a minute ago that sports teams during World War II sometimes combined and played as one. So in 1943 in the NFL, the team from Philadelphia and the team from Pittsburgh played a season as one unified team. What was the name of that team? I'll give you the answer next time. So thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.